What happened to the Middle East? Why is it that the area, so rich in world history, could be such a hotbed of conflict and a disaster in the making? How to achieve peace in the Middle East is a point of analysis and contention that's been discussed endlessly. But why hasn't that been figured out? There's no doubt that thoughtless and obscene imperialistic meddling of the West, from the Iranian coup to the financial support of the Saud regime, to Lebanon and Syria, to Yemen, and of course Iraq, have severely destabilized the region. These imperialist ventures have been done not in the name of building the nations or spreading democracy and freedom, as the propaganda might have you believe, but instead they've been pernicious geopolitical strategies that have decimated the region. The territorial disputes between the Israelis and the Palestinians is surely a major obstacle to the prospect for stability in the region. Ultimately, however, the prerequisite to a political solution must be the evolution of consciousness in the region itself. It will never come about otherwise. This means that secular Israelis that are non-imperialistic and non-racist, who have empathy for their Palestinian brothers and sisters, must take power in Israel. And this means that the Islamic world must have its long-awaited reformation. When secular, enlightened Israelis are at the negotiating table with secular, enlightened Palestinians, peace and sanity may finally be achieved. Finally, we in the West should not have the subtle racism of lowered expectations for the Arab world. Rather than seeing the Arab world as incapable of evolving, we must empower those enlightened figures in the region to stimulate a cultural reformation. Make no mistake, while much of the mayhem in the Middle East is a direct result of Western intervention, we must not hide the elephant in the room by missing the fact that secular Muslims, for example, like those in Turkish metropolises, are facing tension with radicalized Muslims. Furthermore, the Islamic civil war is already underway, with Shia versus Sunni playing out in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere, while the Shia-Sunni behemoths, Saudi Arabia and Iran, play these wars as proxies as they themselves inch towards possible conflict. The only way for the Middle East to be saved is for the secular Muslims to gain power and to promote the Islamic Reformation, which could sweep the Arab world by storm and modernize its sensibilities. The solution to the Middle East, then, has a historical precedent: the visionary leader, Mustafa Ataturk. Ataturk was president of Turkey in the early 20th century. He brought Turkey into the modern world, practically single-handedly, by introducing sweeping reforms in all aspects of Turkish society: political, legal, economic, social, psychological, religious, and cultural. He was non-religious, and he viewed Turkey as a great nation even prior to the introduction of Islam. So too are the other nations of the Middle East, rich in history, independent of the newly arrived religion. Among Ataturk's reforms, he abolished turbans and the fez in favor of Western suits and hats. He described the hijab as a ridiculous object. He changed the traditional Islamic calendar to the Western Gregorian calendar. Islam was no longer constitutionally recognized as the state religion. It was now a secular nation with religious freedom. His principles included republicanism, populism, secularism, reformism, nationalism, and statism. In other words, using the power of the state to transform the nation and implement modernization. We can look to other secular reformists like Gamal Nasser in Egypt as inspiration as well. The point is, we must espouse the emergence of secular visionary leaders who will give their people a national identity independent of religion and transform those societies. Or there are always people who say that things can't be done, that it'll be too hard, or there will be too much resistance to do too much. Ataturk and others like Nasser prove them wrong. Strong leaders who sincerely love their people and who have a strong, enlightened vision can achieve anything. This not only applies to solving the Middle East problem, this applies to all societies. Many of us would be surprised at the rich history of Enlightenment ideals that have historically existed in the Middle East. Most Western minds imagine Enlightenment ideals to be exclusively European, while consistent images of conflict and religious zealotry taint our perceptions of the true cultural richness and potential of the Middle East. Let's take a look at a few examples that completely disprove the simplistic stereotypes and hopefully provide a deeper context and hope for the future of the region. While Islam swept the Middle East and North Africa within the century following the death of Muhammad, one of the most fascinating facts about the history of Islam is that its most enlightened moment was from the 8th to 10th centuries, not long after its very founding. Just as Christianity as a whole has many different schools of thought, from literalist interpretations to the more secular, so too has Islam had a wide variety of schools of thought that varied in interpretation. In this period, the Abbasid Caliphate, based in Basra and Baghdad, in modern-day Iraq, was the intellectual center of the known world. The dominant interpretation of Islam, including that of the power base that ruled from Basra, was known as Mu'tazila. In stark contrast to modern-day literalist Wahhabism, the school of thought of both ISIS and Saudi Arabia, Mu'tazila asserted that knowledge was derived from reason, and that reason alone was the final arbiter in deciding right and wrong. In the context of a Mu'tazila culture, debate gatherings were assembled that allowed Christians, Jews, Muslims, and philosophers of all ideologies to debate and exchange their ideas, something that would be unthinkable in a modern and Islamic state. It was an era in which Muslim leaders were open to foreign ideas, gathering Indian, Persian, and Greek knowledge. As a result, they were highly influenced by the likes of Plato and Aristotle, culminating into a culture of humanism and secularism. There was even emancipation of women. The belief was that it was absolutely essential to question everything. Mu'tazilists claimed that Islam without reason has no value, and that matters of belief should be decided on reason and evidence. So when you think about the Islamic Golden Age, the era of Avicenna and Averroes, the invention of algebra, the advancement of science, engineering, medicine, and the like, it is extremely important to understand it was only under this Mu'tazila context that such a renaissance could flourish. As was the case many generations later with Ataturk, a visionary enlightened leader was largely responsible for the proliferation of these values. The 7th century Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun was a patron of these Mu'tazila values. He patronized the translations of international texts on astronomy, mathematics, literature, medicine, philosophy, logic, and music. He built a center of learning in Basra, which historians largely credit for the sparking of the Golden Age, and is considered to have been the most ambitious intellectual center since the Library of Alexandria. By the mid-9th century, this center had the largest collection of books in the world. Al-Ma'mun was also responsible for the building of madrasas, state-funded centers of learning across the Abbasid Empire. These state-funded centers formally institutionalized Mu'tazila doctrine and sought to eradicate other Islamic schools. The scholars of these madrasas were made to pledge their allegiance to Mu'tazilism and submit to the curricula of Neoplatonic philosophy and Aristotelian metaphysics. Their teaching stated that the Quran must be interpreted through a rationalist lens and not literally. Al-Ma'mun was so zealous about these values, he even embarked on what was called Mihna, an inquisition to stamp out unenlightened schools of thought in favor of Mu'tazilism. No bad thing. Of course, history proves fragile, and eventually opponents who espoused Quranic literalism and endarkenment regained power. In their wake, Mu'tazilism was stamped out, reversing the progress of the Golden Age, and Islam, as many of us know it today, ruled the day. Many purist Islamic theologians even use the word Mu'tazilite as an epithet to denounce opponents as being too liberal to this day. Had Al-Ma'mun's Mu'tazila legacy continued unhindered, the Middle East could have evolved much more the way Europe had, even at an earlier time than Europe itself did, following its Renaissance and Enlightenment, which broke the shackles of Christianity. But as it goes, these European values were largely responsible for an enlightened resurgence in the Middle East many, many years later, beginning with Napoleon's famous expedition to Egypt beginning in 1798. To put this expedition into context, the rise of Napoleon immediately followed the French Revolution, which was born from a culture of Enlightenment values like republicanism, secularism, and philosophy. Napoleon was a product of this revolution, and himself was devoted to these Enlightenment principles, seeking to spread these ideals in his wake. So when he arrived in Egypt, he brought with him a scientific expedition. Along the ranks of his army were scientists, engineers, and mathematicians. He created a society of learning called the Institut d'Egypte with the aim of propagating Enlightenment values through interdisciplinary work, serving a similar knowledge disseminating function as Al-Ma'mun's madrasas almost a millennium earlier. This expedition brought to Egypt the region's first printing press, which fast-tracked the proliferation of knowledge and ideals throughout the Muslim world once again, sparking a new renaissance of thought unseen since the days of Mu'tazila. This renaissance that was birthed from the cultural shock of Napoleon's arrival was known as Al-Nakhda, which literally means Renaissance in Arabic. The 19th century marked a period of intellectual modernization and reform, fast-tracking the cultural and ideological evolution of the region. While the enlightened Mu'tazila school was based mostly in Basra in Iraq, this new Al-Nahda Renaissance was based in Cairo, Egypt. In yet another example of an enlightened leader spurring a positive cultural shift, it began with an Egyptian ruler named Muhammad Ali, who rose to power after Napoleon left and who was highly influenced by the values imported by the French expedition. Ali originated the concept of national self-determination in the modern Arab world, as he sought to create Egyptian autonomy to replace Ottoman rule. In the 1820s, Ali sent the first educational mission of Egypt to students in Europe. This contact of cultural exchange resulted with the bringing back to the Middle East many new ideas from Europe, and this led to the birth of new literature that is considered the dawn of Arabic literary renaissance. Al-Nahda was spurred by notable enlightened thought leaders. Going through all of them in detail is beyond the scope of this video, but here's a brief overview of some of the most important ones. Rifa al-Takhtawi was an Egyptian writer and intellectual who was among the first Egyptians to write about Western cultures in an attempt to bring about reconciliation and an understanding between Islamic and Christian civilizations. He founded the School of Languages in 1835 and was influential in the development of science, law, literature, and Egyptology in 19th century Egypt. Muhammad Abduh was an Egyptian scholar and liberal Islamic reformer. He was an ardent rationalist and, most interestingly, sought to explicitly revitalize Mu'tazila in the modern era and is known as the founding figure of Neo-Mu'tazilism. Butrus al-Bustani was a Lebanese secularist and educator and was known as the master of the Arabic Renaissance. He founded a secular madrasa known as Al-Wataniya in Beirut in 1863 that educated its students in Arabic, French, English, Turkish, Latin, and Greek, as well as modern science. Al-Bustani welcomed students from all religions and races and qualified his teaching staff not based on religious standing, but on their merit and professionalism. This school is thought to have been successful in disseminating Al-Nahda values because it was the main such institution in the region that was explicitly based on secular ideals, on equality and non-discrimination, putting it in stark contrast with other schools that had closed themselves off to the modern world. As you can see, madrasas have played an important role in the development of Arabic thought. From Al-Ma'mun to Muhammad Ali to Butrus al-Bustani, these building of these centers of knowledge based on rationalist ideals have been extremely consequential in the dissemination of thought and culture in the Arab world. However, all these forces of light and reason have had to contend with forces of darkness and superstition, which unfortunately have gained victories in modern times. Not long before Napoleon's arrival in Egypt did Muhammad al-Wahhab gain prominence in Saudi Arabia. Wahhab sparked an ultra-literalist and reactionary Islamic movement. It is not well known that the spiritual rise of Wahhab coincided with the military rise of Muhammad bin Saud in the 18th century, the founder of the Saudi dynasty, which bears his name to this day. Saud was a chieftain bent on consolidation of military and political power, while Wahhab was a fanatical Islamic purist bent on the dissemination of the most regressive interpretation of Islam imaginable. In 1744, these men created an alliance to symbolize temporal and spiritual power, creating the first Saudi state and setting in motion the historical conditions that led to the modern Saudi state, whose official state religion to this day is Wahhabist Islam. While it's common knowledge that the Saud royal family directly traced their royal lineage to the Saud patriarch, many might be surprised to find out that the parallel to the Saud lineage is the Wahhab lineage, who are the leading religious family that trace their ancestry directly to Wahhab himself. In fact, these two families have continued the temporal spiritual power-sharing arrangement founded by the two patriarchs in 1744 to this day. Today, the religious family is known as Al-Ash Sheikh, and consistently hold the highest positions in the Saudi theocracy. This is extremely important to understand because rather than, as most people think, the Saudi Arabian establishment merely being adherents to strict Islam, it is much more entrenched and pernicious than that. The Wahhabist literalist interpretation is fundamentally woven into the power structure systematically through the rule of these two families. According to Wikipedia, quote, "The family continues to hold many of the most important religious posts in Saudi Arabia. For example, the current Grand Mufti is a member of the family, Abdul Aziz ibn Abdullah al-Aish Sheikh. The family's position is derived not only from their role in the ulema, but also from being closely linked to Al Saud by a high degree of intermarriage." Now, and this is where the pieces connect to explain the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the modern age, which would seem to be a contradiction given the rise of knowledge and communication technology in the last 200 years. This Saudi arrangement happened to geographically take place atop one of the greatest oil reserves in the world, right as oil began to become the lifeblood of the world economy. Having won the geographical lottery, massive riches began to pour into this country in the 20th century. And all of a sudden, this theocratic nation that was centuries behind the modern world was afforded extreme influence in world affairs. The Saudis then began to build madrasas across the Islamic world. Madrasas that disseminated the tenets of literalist Islamic theology and the seeds of Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS were spread. Madrasas then, as we see, can be a tool for good or evil. Then, the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran in 1979, bringing Shia Islamic purism to a country that had been one of the most culturally advanced in the region, dragging it back centuries in thought, and the seeds of the Islamic Shia-Sunni civil war were laid. Add in Western imperialistic meddling into the mix, which destabilized the region and overthrew secular leadership, fragmenting the region into religious sects, and the tinderbox of the ages has emerged. In the midst of this chaos, however, there is a glimmer of hope, which brings me to the final example of enlightenment in the Middle East, and is especially important because it exists right now and happens to be geographically in the midst of the chaos. The little-known region of Rojava is in Syrian Kurdistan and is involved in what is known as the Rojava conflict, theater of the Syrian civil war. They are a semi-autonomous region that has enlightened culture in stark contrast to the surrounding areas. They ratified a constitution in January of 2014 that provided that all residents have the right of gender equality, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech. It incorporates the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and other guarantees of economic and cultural rights for its citizens. Rojava is constructed as a federation of communities that practice localism and communalism with shared values of self-defense and environmentalism, and sought to establish, quote, a variety of groups, committees, and communes on the streets, in neighborhoods, villages, counties, and small and big towns everywhere. In effect, it resembles the canton system of Switzerland. Yes, you heard that right. A region right in the midst of the Syrian civil war, guarantees human rights, and is run like Switzerland. The economy of Rojava is run under what they call the People's Economy Plan, which has an economy of co-ops and small-scale private property accountable to the democratic will of locally organized councils. The political agenda of Rojava explicitly states that it is, quote, trying to break the honor-based religious and tribal rules that confine women. So, while at first glance, the Middle East might seem hopelessly entangled in conflict and darkened ideology, there is indeed hope. In summary, the solution for peace in the Middle East is as follows. Leaders like Al-Mahmoud, Muhammad Ali, Gamal Nasser, and Ataturk come to power and implement nationalist, secularist policies. They invest heavily in secular, rationalist madrasas. New Islamic thought leaders come to prominence in the tradition of Mu'tazila and Al-Nahda, spreading the new enlightenment across the Islamic world. The political and economic model of Rojava catches on and spreads across the region. When the dust settles, the Middle East may finally be equivalent in culture and scientific output as the West, and will bring the world one step closer to a global age of reason.